Tandem Nomads, episode 226.
So thought leadership these days is really a way of connecting to the right people. And it's just helping them to see the world in the way that you do.
Hello, Nomad Nation. Welcome to Tandem Nomads, the podcast show and entrepreneurship platform where you can find great inspiration and tips to grow a successful portable business and thrive in your global nomadic life. This is your host, Amel Daregi. I'm a business and marketing coach and the founder of Tandem Nomads. One of the great ways I always recommend my clients to be able to get more exposure and be seen in their industry as the go-to expert is speaking engagement. I'm a big fan of that marketing strategy. And to speak about that specific strategy, I brought to you a great expert in the matter, Jessika Lynch. Jessika, are you ready for this ride?
I am. Thanks, Amel.
My pleasure. I'm so happy to have you here. Nomad Nation, I would like to introduce you to Jessika. Here is in few words who she is. So she helps people and organizations make more impact through leadership and communication. Her work as a leadership strategist and change communication specialist is focused on coaching and supporting thought leaders in public speaking, strategic positioning, and high impact communication. So Jessika is the founder of a boutique communication and leadership coaching agency for thought leaders called Revolve for Impact. And also, she leads a foundation called Women Talk Tech to make more room for female experts on tech stages. In addition, she has been a TEDx licensee as well as a TED and TEDx speaker coach for over 10 years. Through this work, she has programmed and coached hundreds of speakers, authors, and business leaders, supporting them in both leadership and in bringing their ideas to life. I could have not dreamt a better person than you to come talk about this topic, Jessika. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It is such a pleasure to be here. And nice to connect with your audience. We've been talking about it for a while.
We've been exchanging now for a couple of years, I think, and I've always been loving all what you do and what you put out there. And I do believe that and I've lived it in my own business. Speaking engagement has been actually one of my top marketing strategies to attract clients, and I always recommend it. But sometimes it requires some expertise to be able to do it confidently. But I'd love to, just in a few minutes before we get into this topic, to get to know you a little bit. How did you get to be specialized in this? And you're such a you're the TEDx expert, actually, that I know of. And I would love to know how you came about this.
Sure. So we've covered this before. I know a lot of your audience are in different countries. I also am American, as you can hear from my voice, but I've lived in the Netherlands for 25 years. So I came here at the end of high school. And one of the things I noticed here, I studied communications, and I was working in communication in tech companies as a communications person, manager, director. And one of the things I noticed was that, Dutch people in many European countries also don't have the type of communication training, basically, that we had in the US growing up and going to school, presenting ourselves from kindergarten. It just wasn't the way that education went here. So where I was very comfortable speaking and telling my story and presenting myself, I found that colleagues in companies weren't. At the same time, so this is a little bit of a story of being in the right place at the right time, TED started licensing TEDx. So what that meant was it stopped being this exclusive event in California. Well, it still is, but they started having this also independently promoted event program in 2009. And I just happened to hear about it and get excited about it. So I started volunteering for that organization in the Netherlands right from the start, and then realized, hey, this is actually something super fun that I love. And it's so nice working with all these speakers. So I was working in communications and also on the side working for TEDx. And little by little, those started to merge because all of my clients, had my own business at that point. I was a communications consultant, and I was finding all my clients didn't care as much about the collateral rollout that I was doing for the organization. They actually wanted to sit down at lunch with me and talk about how they could present better and be a little bit more inspiring. That's my most common request. How do I be more inspiring?
Love it.
So yeah, it kind of found me a little bit more than I found it. And it's just been like a really exciting journey since then.
And I love in your story how you also frame like what is the problem that you solve as well. And a lot of people look for business ideas or have businesses. I do love how you just frame that. So Nomad Nation, if you're listening, listen to what Jessika just said before. Speaking of tips and speaking, it's really important to be able to frame that. But let's back off a little bit. I would like you to share like why would you recommend speaking engagement? What are the benefit? What happens when you start speaking on stage for a business owner, be it virtually or physically in a space?
Well, if I could back up for a moment, even like to zoom out from not even just talking about speaking, if we're talking about entrepreneurs here, but talking about really knowing and understanding your story and the value that you're bringing, because to me, that's really what the whole thing is about, is kind of getting right in there, kind of what's the foundation of what you're bringing out there into the world, understanding kind of why you're doing it and what's special and unique and interesting about it. Because every business owner, sometimes we lose it along the way, but every business owner has that in them. So to me, it's about really owning and understanding your story. And then once you do that, being able to bring it out on stages is fantastic, not only for your business, but for other people. I mean, there's other people who are interested in what you have to offer when you can authentically, sorry to use that word, but it just comes up in my field, when you can authentically share what you're doing, how you're doing it. There's always people who are looking for that. And it's not only that you are looking for them, but they're looking for you. So being on a stage and in front of lots of people gives you the opportunity to kind of cast that net in a really wide way and find your people.
Yeah. If I try to sum up what you're trying to say here, although it's so, I love how you backed it up even further. It was a great idea because what it tells me is going into speaking engagement first helps get clarity on our messaging for our own sake, first of all, like aligning with our own story and understanding where we can make an impact by reflecting on those topics. And we'll talk about that. And
Exactly.
then obviously, once we do that work and get clarity on our messaging, it helps us be more effective with attracting the right people in our business and getting visibility.
Yes. Exactly. Very well summarized. Thank you.
Thank you. But I love what you said that here. Now, I want to just real quick talk about some of the limiting beliefs that I hear when I suggest speaking engagement is to say, but who am I to who is going to want to listen to me? Or even a little bit of fear of stage fear, obviously, the fear of speaking in front of an audience. So these are the two big objections that I hear when we're just starting out in business, or sometimes even we have experience in business, but not in getting visibility. What would you answer to those objections or limiting beliefs?
Maybe let's take them each separately. So the first one is, I'm nobody. Who wants to hear from me? Interestingly enough, I know that your listeners here and the people that you tend to work with are entrepreneurs for the most part. A lot of times the people that I work with are in leadership, and believe it or not, even people who are in certain leadership roles within a company might also have that fear of, who wants to hear from me. So it's a lot easier to hide behind the idea of like, okay, let me just present the company rather than let me present my own spin on it. I feel like this sounds a little fluffy, but it's truly true. I really believe this. And I have found this from working really with hundreds of people. This has never, ever been wrong. That every single person has a different lived experience, and as a result has a completely different way of seeing the world. You talked about framing before, how I frame my own story. everybody has their own frame. And so bringing other people into your frame essentially, teaches people something, or it has the ability to show something. And I literally have never come across another person on this earth that I've had a conversation with where that hasn't been true. So that would be my answer to people who are feeling like that. Like, what do I have to offer? That's what you have to offer. The experience that you've had that I haven't.
This is so true. I had a mentor of mine when I was just starting out, very like 10 years ago, who told me there will always be somebody who knows less than you do. So you will always be the expert of something because every person has one thing that she knows better than another.
Exactly. That is exactly the point. And it is, I think it's something that really holds us back too. The need to, we have these kind of constructs sometimes in society, especially women, but, men too, but especially women, of like what an expert is, what somebody who should be on a stage is, what the qualifications are for a leader. And even though we want to like break all of those predefined definitions, they're still sort of like living in our thoughts and in our bodies. And to me, the idea of an expert can be really very different than what our preconceived notions are. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a PhD in a topic. You often are expert of experience, and that could be, of your various different string of experiences. There's always a way to tie all of this together and show sort of your line of expertise. It's just, I think we don't tend to tap into it as much. We're kind of wrapped up in the old way of thinking about it sometimes.
Right. And how about the fear of stage? Is there any quick tip you can share to deal with it?
So the fear of stage is I mean, real. They say that public speaking is like in the top 3 fears, or maybe it's the number 1 fear. There's fear of death, and there's another fear, but public speaking is in there with death. So it's a very real thing for people to fear stages, and not something that I would want to be dismissive about and say like, oh, don't worry, you'll be fine, because it is very real. And of course you will be fine. But my trick, actually, this takes a little work, of course, too, but is to understand, it goes back to what we were just talking about with expertise, is to understand what you're there for, what you have to offer, and really understand your story. And that can lessen your fear a lot when you understand what you're there for, and you feel rooted in the value of what you're offering. Because when we don't, we start getting rooted in the fear of what people are thinking about us, what might happen if we mess up, those kind of things.
So true.
And maybe I can add one more thing, which is a bit unrelated, but I'll tell you like a little story, which is a couple of years ago, I was at a TEDx event, and there was a guy speaking who, speaks all the time. And he's the head of a country. I don't want to give too many details to say like who this guy is, but he is the head of a country program really high up in a particular country's tourism program. And he was presenting this whole new way of urban design for tourists. Anyway, I think he got in his head that it was a high stakes presentation, and he just completely had a blackout. And he had like the worst blackout I've seen from somebody. I've seen people stumble on their words, but this guy was really like, oh, I know, I feel like I'm maybe going to faint, or he was having a hard time getting air. He had to get some water. Somebody came on stage to help him see if he was okay. I ended up starting over again. But before we started over, I was sitting in the audience. There are people around me who were just like, come on, buddy, you can do it. Yes, you got this. I mean, everybody around me was like, yeah, you can do it. And when he said he was going to start over, the whole audience gave him a standing ovation. And I love this story. It felt great as an audience member. I felt like I felt emotional, like I wanted
I'm
to
actually being
cry,
tearing up right now.
actually. Yeah. But it was so special because I thought, wow, we all fear his moment. Like we feel like we can't get through it. And we are so worried about what people are thinking of us. And at the end of the day, the worst thing that can happen is that everybody's cheering for us.
Yeah,
I mean, everybody is like looking at our success. So that vulnerability is actually like, it's all right.
I
You're
love it.
human.
So inspiring. I love that. And thanks for sharing that. So let's go now more into the practical aspects of like speaking engagement. And the first thing I think that you and I agree on, I know that I've seen so many people trying to do speaking engagement that will just speak of a lot of everything and nothing at the same time and change
Mm-hmm.
topics all the time. And I always say it's important to have your key signature talks, like your one specific key signature talk, up to three, no more, to help you really align with your business and your goals, and so that you can also be seen as the go-to expert in this field. So, any tips that you might have on how to choose that key topic?
Sure. I think that's great advice, by the way. I often tell that to people too. And it doesn't mean that you have to branch or you have to kind of put yourself into a box and
Mm,
not be able to branch out at any point. But it does mean like, let's get some clarity here.
mm,
Get to the center of it all. And then maybe when you say max three, sometimes they're not usually three different ones. They might be like variations of,
correct.
if you're speaking to tandem nomads, you might say, okay, this is my talk for entrepreneurs. This is my talk for, let's say, families in, transition periods between countries, et cetera. So you have like kind of different audiences and nuanced ways of speaking to them.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get to your topic? So what I advise people to do is come to one core message. And that core message might be something that you never actually say out loud. Doesn't matter. But so that you know in your head what value you're trying to offer to people. So coming up with that what I just said sounds like, okay, that's super easy, but it's not. So coming up with that core message, I suggest to people that they put the word should in it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a great fan of the word should in general, I must say, except when it comes to this core message. So the reason the word should is there means people are currently doing one thing, and the new way that I'm going to talk to them about is something new. So it's kind of introducing that the current way is not exactly the best and the new way is. So, for example, let's see, I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head. So if I say in my own business, if I want to do a talk and I say I want to talk to business leaders, I might say you should dare to put more of yourself in business presentations. The assumption is they're not putting enough of themselves in business presentations, and they should. So that's how I would suggest coming up with a core message and then crafting, however the marketing jacket that you put on that core signature speech, crafting it around that core message and the value that you're offering people.
This is so good, Jessica. I love this tip with the should. Nomad Nation, put notes on this one. This is so good. And if I may, I just want to share how your strategy, actually, I didn't know about it, but indirectly fits to what happened to me. Like for me, what I recommend is to list the objections that we have from our potential clients from actually taking action and buying or consuming our product or service and addressing it in your
Yes.
keynote. And in my case was like, the big problem when I started Tandem Nomads is that expat partners were not thinking as entrepreneurship as a solution to their dual career challenges. So my whole topic was, why is entrepreneurship the solution to dual career challenges? So that then later I can talk about marketing and how to make it happen. But before, I needed to change the mindset of this audience so that later they can consider, okay, now how do I do it?
Right. Exactly. That and that to me what the example that you just gave is exactly kind of what we're talking about here too.
Right.
Like always do the zoom out. What's the big picture here? And then you could do the zoom in of like, here's all the nuts and bolts, and here are the cases, and here are the things that we offer, maybe, but that's not the big picture.
I love it. I love it. I'm going to note this idea of the should. It's so good. So now that we know what we want to talk about, I was wondering if you have any key tips about delivering this, like in terms of actual speaking engagement, be it virtually or even on stage. What are the key mistakes made, for instance, that you see that you think could be quickly fixed?
Okay. So that's a big area. I'll try to cover it in 5 minutes.
I know.
No, just kidding.
We'll have to go to you to learn more, but yes, that's why I say, where are the areas where you can have a quick fix? Because I know it definitely
exactly.
requires, yeah.
Well, you mentioned virtual and in person, and I'm gonna share one thing about both that is effective for both virtual and in person. So what I find is that one of the biggest mistakes that people make, or it's a big tip, however you look at it, is sharing emotions when you're delivering a talk. So what I find is like you and me having a conversation over a coffee, we might laugh, we would tell some story like, and you would never believe what happened then, like really being emotive with each other.
Right.
And then for whatever reason, the tendency with people is to lose that on stage. When in fact, we kind of have to double it on stage. We have to be a bigger version of ourselves than we would be in person. So the thing is, when you and me if we're back to the cafe having a coffee and we're telling some story and we're laughing, we do impersonations of what the lady said, and oh, it's so funny. You are totally like right with me. We're right there. We're in the middle of this funny story. We're cracking up. You feel it because I'm telling you in the way that it felt to me. So when people are then on stage telling the same story, if you don't add in that emotion, other people just can't feel it. So that's kind of the way you transfer things over to me. And that is actually the key, or it's one of the keys to being inspiring generally. So also to sort of, this is like a side note, but when I do training sometimes in business, I ask people, who are the most inspiring people that you can think of as speakers? So they might say, like, let's say Obama or Simon Sinek or Martin Luther King, for example. Martin Luther King is a little different because the core of his message is generally very inspiring. But all of those speakers, and many other ones that they've mentioned, Oprah, for example, tend to be really emotive speakers. No one will ever say the reason that they love this person is because they were so theatrical or dramatic. But that's part of what makes us love them, is that we feel their feelings. Like when Oprah is there and she's like, look under your chair, we're all like, yes. So kind of like transfer the excitement or the frustration or the sadness through doing that. And so many people shy away and feel like, oh, now I'm on stage. Let me be my professional self who just tells my story about what I'm doing, and I'll tell about my company based in 60 countries and 20 languages. Exactly. Like that kind of
You're
kind
so
of
good
tone.
impersonating it. It's so good. I love that. It's such a good tip. I think we should really remember that in Emanation. And this one objection that I keep hearing about this one is, oh, it depends on culture. I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm like, don't let culture intimidate you, because from a culture to another, people react differently. I know, like, for example, when I go to Austria and I speak there, even when I speak to certain countries on webinars, I do see that engagement is different from a culture to another.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that I need to change my personality. And that's really important. And even if they are not engaging that way, I think they can still see who you are if you show who you are.
Exactly. You're so right. I think that's such an interesting point that you're speaking about right now. I just finished reading a book called The Culture Map. I don't know if you know this one.
Yes.
Really interesting. So I have like on the top of mind the kind of the cultural differences that we might have. And I can understand when people talk about cultural differences as like in the context of how they're going to speak and relay their messages, but not as an objection, just more as okay, this is a consideration. Let's be considerate of that culture. But actually, what we might consider more is like, I work in the Netherlands. That is very kind of the Dutch word translated as like a sober culture,
That's a
which,
good word.
in a speaking environment kind of means it can be very flat. So consider those cultural inflections, because when you're not like that, that stands out. Also, it's very interesting. Sometimes I feel like people hide behind like, oh, I don't want to be too American.
Right.
I can
That's
say
the
this because I'm
argument I didn't dare to
American.
say.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I was like, I have the background to be free to say something like that, because there's a concern that they're going to be overly salesy or too emotive or something like that. But usually the thing you fear is the thing you maybe need a tiny bit of when it comes to speaking anyway.
All right. And here comes the question that I really wanted to bring you in for as the expert of TEDx is, once we learn about all these key tips about speaking, at some point we start needing to actually reach out to speaking engagement opportunities. And one of the big one is the stage of TEDx. So what are the key tips that you can share with us on how to actually land it? First of all, specifically TEDx speaking engagement, and if you have any tips on other in general as well, might be interesting.
Sure. Well, so I will say people come to me with request, like when people say, hey, I might want to work with you, it's very often to land a TED talk. So the first thing I'll say is like, hey, let's jump on the phone and see if we're a nice fit for each other. And the first thing I'll say during that call, or maybe the second thing or whatever, is usually, if you set out just to land a TED talk, it will probably be less effective for you than if you set out to really craft your message, get the right story down, and start telling it out there into the world. So I feel like TEDx is a stop on the journey, but when it becomes the destination, you often kind of lose all the opportunities that you might have in terms of speaking. Speaking can be very rich for you outside of just TEDx. So that's often what I tell people first, in general. I'll tell you, though, from my experience in programming TEDx, what those best practices tend to be from a programmer perspective.
First, that would be interesting, yeah.
Yeah, that might be useful to know. So what's also good to know, though, is that TEDx in general is that X stands for independently operated. So there are some heavy brand guidelines from TED. There are guidelines for speaking, or sorry, for who the speakers can be and what they can speak about on stage. But the decisions that are made for what's placed on stage are by the licensees themselves or the curators, whether that's the same person or not. There's a difference between TEDx types. So there's smaller TEDx's that are only allowed to have 100 people, or they're larger ones that can have more than 100 people. The reason that would matter to a speaker, because those talks all end up on the same channel, the reason that might matter to a speaker is that usually the licensee who can have 100 people or more has gone through extensive training from TED. And what that means is usually that they have more experience, but that they really kind of have the TED values and brand values in mind. That doesn't mean that a smaller event doesn't, but it's pretty guaranteed that they do if they've had more training. So I usually recommend for people to go for more established events that have been around longer. That being said, so as a programmer, what you're taught by TED when you do go through that extensive training is to look for the ideas and not per se the person. So within the TEDx community, the programmers community, we all have some nice little groups and stuff where we keep in touch. there's always this complaint like, hey, has anybody else been getting this mail from this coach? So we might get, somebody in Kyoto might get the same mail as someone in Dubai as me in Amsterdam from the same person who's like, hi, I'm a coach and I'd like to tell this story about XYZ. And here's why I'd be great for TEDx. And it's sort of a very generic proposal that is basically like blanketed out and sent to everybody. There is a certain feeling within the TEDx community of like, oh, those people are just trying to get the TED Talk, right? So back to don't make TEDx the destination. Instead of really being out there and speaking about their ideas and letting us see what their idea is all about. So TEDx programmers are looking for people who are speaking about their ideas in other, let's say, media, on other platforms, kind of walking the talk before landing the talk. So that's also why I say focus on that journey of like really getting your story out there in the world, and the TED Talk will come as one of those steps.
And what you're saying about TEDx stages or TED stage, there's one TED stage and multiple TEDx stages, is to actually cater to the leader of that platform. That's really important. But also the second thing is start talking. The goal is to talk. And then at some point, making it an obsession will not help, right? So I think it's really important to do it. But first, be led by the actual topic, like the fire that you have in you to share that message, rather than the goal itself of that platform.
Exactly.
But is there any tips that you could share of what to do instead that can help actually, and how to adapt that approach to reaching out to the platforms to be able to land the speaking engagement?
So I said what not to do in terms of TEDx. So no generic blanket copy paste to a whole bunch of people. That being said, and that's especially in TEDx because TEDx organizers do talk. But that being said, if you were to write to anybody about a speaking opportunity, so let's say somebody is contacting you to be on the Tandem Nomads podcast, I'm going to guess that if someone says, hi, Amel, I've been listening to the Tandem Nomads podcast for a long time. I like what you do in terms of, XYZ. I find the topics, this, and this that you've been covering to be really interesting, and that you're speaking to this type of an audience is very interesting too. I also speak with entrepreneurs, and here's my message. If they really begin and connect with you, then you feel like as a platform, and I'm using you as an example, but I'm guessing that this is true. But what you would feel then as a platform is much more seen, and that you feel that proposal is intentional.
Right. So I see it all the time. Yeah.
Connect with your audience, no matter what you're doing, whether you're pitching yourself, whether you're speaking on stage, whether you are, coming up with copy for your website or for LinkedIn. The idea is that you're making a connection with the people who are going to see it or hear it. Mm-hmm. And so that's the same thing with proposing yourself for speaking opportunities. Right. So on a really, kind of logistical note of how to do that, I would start with thinking about what your, for example, going back to that signature talk that you were saying, or your signature message. So figuring out what that message is and doing your research, looking around at like, what are some events and places, podcasts, places where I can get that message out, and just listing them and knowing like, okay, I could talk to this podcast, let's say the Tandem Nomads podcast, about being an entrepreneur and getting your speaking engagements and getting your word out there. I could talk to this particular virtual summit about this value, kind of make a list like that. Okay, who are the organizers? Who can I contact? What can I connect with them on? Your copy paste can maybe be in the middle in terms of what that signature topic is, but the kind of jacket that you put it in will depend on where you're doing your pitch. Yes. And I would say pitching 10 places in that type of personal way will probably be 10 times more effective than pitching 100 in a copy paste generic kind of way.
This is such a great tip here, Jessica. And one thing I start to see is people who do try that thing of trying to adapt and be personal, but it doesn't feel personal. It's like, oh, I love tandem nomads. It's so great what you do. But you can see that they've never listened to a single episode. So
Right.
being specific, right? And those who I pay attention to is when I see that actually this person has seen the nitty-gritty thing, little detail that only if you paid attention you would know. So I think that's how you also get a bit of the attention of the person who makes the decision.
Exactly. And it's good for you too, right? You want to speak on platforms where you know, because I'm telling you, once you get into speaking, you will realize, especially if you've done it before, you will know exactly what I mean. It takes a lot of energy to prepare a talk. So there's no point in doing it if it's not the right audience for you. Why would you do that? If your message isn't aligned. So take the time to make sure that it's the right audience for you, and then it's easy to write the pitch.
Love that. Love how we align so much. I know that, how like everything you're saying is so aligned as well with any tips with reaching out to a client, even without speaking. That's such a good tip of how to reach out to someone. And at Nation, I have a whole episode actually of how to phrase your request. And I will put it in the show notes of this episode. Is this method that I call the you, me, us. Like first start with them and then show how what you have to offer fits into that, and then finally finish with how can we collaborate, what can we do together. And actually that's again about them, right?
I love that. I just before we met today, I was just in a client call right before this, and I was talking about it, and he was talking about it. We were kind of going together of like, how can we create the us? This is for a talk that he's going to give. And anytime you can connect with somebody else on the level of us, then you're not just kind of talking to them like, hey, I'm standing up here and you're down there and we're different. But if you can be equals with people and speak on that type of level, then there's a trust there.
That's so good.
If you're doing it in a true way, right? But where can we connect in some way? So I would do that on a stage, do it in a pitch, do it in a podcast, etc. But, kind of as fellow entrepreneurs, as fellow people working in whatever industry, as fellow tandem nomads.
Oh, yeah. And you keep saying something that I want to highlight is being authentic. And this is so important. You kept saying it all along our interview. And I really want to insist on that part, because no matter if you do it through voice, through video, or through writing, people know when you're not being authentic, but also people know when you are being authentic, and that also a great way to connect as well. So that's important. So yeah, thanks for that. And Nomad Nation, I will put that episode on the You, Me, Us inside the show notes of this episode, tandemnomads.com/224, as well as a lot of resources that Jessica has, which goes back to me asking you, there's so much more we can talk about speaking engagement.
There is. I feel like we could do this all day.
Definitely. And you've got some great experience in that. And I just want to, although you specialize in TEDx, I mean, you do a lot of other things in helping people basically position themselves as leaders and communicate. Yeah, just one thing about that point about TEDx, and that I remember you told me when I was considering TEDx, is like when you plan a TEDx, you might not land the TEDx, but it actually will land you other speaking engagements. And the work you do for that, you're going to be able to replicate it and amplify it with other platforms. So this is really a great tip.
Well, it's funny because that it's so in line with the thing that you mentioned before about what you share with your clients, where you have your clients work on a signature talk. To me, the advice I often give is, let's create a signature talk rather than a TEDx talk, and then, see what comes from there. So I think what you're advising actually is spot on, and completely what I would say too is like, almost forget TEDx. Yes, that's like where my background comes from. So I don't mean it like that. But I mean, kind of forget that as the goal and go for the signature talk.
Yeah, this is so good. And this is where you help people. So actually, could you tell us more about your services and how do you support entrepreneurs and leaders to communicate and set themselves in their industry?
Sure. So I started out just doing speaker coaching. So I would basically, work one-on-one with anybody who has a high stakes talk. I say high stakes, it could be anything, but that's usually what people hire for. But in doing that, just realized how much people kind of also needed to back up and look at why they're speaking in the first place. So I still work with people one-on-one to prepare any kind of speaking engagements that they have. But I've also moved into leadership that covers the area of thought leadership, but it's also, different areas of communication, understanding strengths and weaknesses, et cetera. So I work with people in a program context. So 6-month program, half one-on-one and partially some group work that we do as well, to get you into not only being a speaker, but into a thought leader. And then the next step after that is into a visionary, kind of meet you wherever you are in that spectrum.
I like that. That's really interesting. So what is the best place to find you and your resources?
Oh, thanks for asking. Well, my website is revolveforimpact.com. That's REVOLVE for impact.com.
Yes.
And resources, and my podcast will be on there. I promise that podcast is going to launch, hopefully either by the time this episode airs or shortly afterwards. So the podcast will be there too. And where to find it will be out there as well.
Yes, we'll put all the link on the show notes of this episode. And it's going to be Nomad Nation on tandemnomads.com/224. And we'll put all the links there.
Great. And I also always welcome LinkedIn connections too.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah. So
Nomad Nation too, so.
Yeah, I highly recommend you to check out Jessika's website, podcast, and reach out to her directly if you feel like this is your time to start speaking up, literally, right?
Yes,
speaking up about the topics that you really want to make an impact on. And I know that Jessika and I are both very passionate about helping our clients make an impact. And I could see it like through our conversations, how, the people we want to help are those who want to make an impact. And I believe that speaking is such, literally and figuratively, a great way of making that impact in our fields. So
thank you too. It's been such a pleasure to connect with you this afternoon, and look forward to reading the you, me, us, or to hearing that episode also.
Oh, sure, with pleasure. So thank you for taking the time. I know how busy you are. And at Nomad Nation, so much great resources from Jessika. Check them out, tandemnomads.com/226. I can't wait to meet you in the next episode, Nomad Nation, and stay tuned to turn your challenges into great opportunities.